For those of you who pay attention to world events and who have lived through many events over the years, you will note that this weekend is the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall that happened on November 9th in 1989. And many people are always asked, well, where were you when the Berlin Wall went down? In answering that question, I do have to sometimes sit and reflect on it. This was a momentous event, and it is ingrained in my mind several things that happened that day. I cannot say exactly what happened at the exact moment, basically because of the situation that I was in. I was in high school at the time. I was a junior at Clayton Valley High School and had gotten home from school that day without thinking about much of anything. What I generally did at that time when I was in high school and I got home is I just whip out the newest book that I was reading and start reading it because I was kind of a readaholic. That's how I got through all those emotional things that were going on in high school that a lot of people happened to be going through at the time. And at the time, I rarely paid any attention at all to the news. The news, of course, it was boring. I didn't really care all that much about what was going on in the world, with a few exceptions, of course. But there, of course, were a lot of preconceived notions about the world and how it worked. What was significant here was that I came home, I whipped out my book, and I was sitting down, and there was something on the TV. There was a news flash. Suddenly, your regularly scheduled program was interrupted by this news that has come out in this world, something really significant. And I thought, well, we interrupt your program for the special news bulletin. Usually these news bulletins were significant with what they had to say, but what I saw was actually the last thing I had ever expected to hear from anyone at all, and that was that the Berlin Wall had come down. And sitting there, I was like, you got to be kidding me. The Berlin Wall, that's the division between East and West. That was the symbol of capitalism versus communism. That is the symbol of good versus evil. And certainly that wall is going to be standing up there forever, or at least until World War III breaks out, and who knows what the heck is going to happen in the world when nuclear bombs start going off. Thinking about this, of course, it made me reflect on a lot of things that I had understood about the world. I mean, I grew up, the Soviet Union looked really strong, Eastern Bloc countries. These countries are all communist countries. They're all out there to try and bring down our capitalist system. Karl Marx's ideas, and of course those of Lenin and Stalin, were to spread communism and to topple over governments that were capitalist to replace them with communist governments. And I thought, of course, that these particular countries, they were so strong that they couldn't possibly collapse, especially if they had the Soviet Union. Russia-Soviet Union was kind of the same thing, though Soviet Union included several other countries that are currently independent. And I just thought, wow, this is going to change the whole world. After this, a lot of good things are going to happen. We're going to rush ourselves into a state of prosperity with great things happening. At the time, the country was pretty prosperous, and so things were looking really good. And being a religious person and knowing that in those communist countries, religion was pretty much banned. I mean, it's not necessarily banned per se, but it was pretty much forced to hide in the shadows so that it wasn't, so that its adherents weren't attacked by the secret police if they said the wrong words. And so being a religious person, I thought, wow, this means religion will find its way back into Eastern Europe. And of course, religion did pretty much show its face again in Eastern Europe. And the notion of countries like Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, all of them being open for people to come in and to see their culture rise again from the ashes of communism. That was something really strong on my mind as well. And I think that was kind of one of those rare sparks in my mind at the time that came while I was in high school about how the world was definitely going to be a better place. I was of the opinion that as each year passes by, that better things are always going to be built on top of each other. Reality, of course, is that there's always good and bad things going on in the world. But my emphasis here, of course, is on the communist bloc and what this exactly meant to us as kids in high school and what our parents were telling us. A lot of the time, a lot of the grown-ups that I talked to thought that, well, this has to be some kind of joke or trick. There's no way that this Berlin Wall's gone down. There's no way that communism is not going to continue on and cause problems in the future. And then there are those that said, all right, from now on it's going to be smooth sailing, it's going to be great. And I have to admit that part of my understanding of the world and the way I saw things and how I thought things were going to continue was actually based on my continuous reading of these science fiction fantasy books that I had picked up in high school and I just couldn't put down. Once I was done with one, I picked up another one. These science fiction books were full of either a story about World War III or stories about what the world was like after World War III when all these nuclear bombs went off and decimated everything. We were pretty much raised to fear that nuclear war was happening. There would be a lot of ideas about drills where what people were supposed to do when nuclear war broke out. Of course, it was all nonsense. What can you possibly do if nuclear bombs are coming after you? But they still had to say something in order to mitigate a lot of the fear that was coming out because of this. I did have a few teachers in schools who were downplaying the fear of communism and saying, well, just because these people are doing a few things, don't assume that they just want to go out and kill everybody. But, a lot of those teachers also kind of glossed over a lot of historical events that really were horrific and should not be forgotten as well, that these leaders were doing. Each new novel that came out, every single one of them always predicted a World War III. All of them predicted a sort of survival of the fittest after the nuclear war, after the world has been decimated, all these governments have collapsed, there's going to be people fighting each other over foods, or the northern hemisphere is going to be so radiated that everyone's going to have to migrate to South Africa, South America, so forth, and Australia in order to get away from these toxic lands that were the product of people who were stupid and shouldn't have acted that way. And of course, I thought that, well, a lot of this is definitely going to be plausible in the future. I just hope it happens long after I'm gone. Of course, that is kind of what a lot of people feel, that they see bad things happening and they just hope that they don't live to see the horrible things that happen after that. But after the fall of communism, I saw a lot of sparks of light, a lot of things where cultures were rising up and thriving. Places like Czechoslovakia and Poland especially, you saw all kinds of people rising up to display their cultural identities that had been repressed by the communist leaders over the years. And I thought that that was truly a wonderful thing to see. One thing that communism did that a lot of people probably overlook today is that it pretty much goes and wipes out cultural aspects that it doesn't like. The cultural things that we find that are thriving, they're unique. These things are of great worth and need to be preserved. A lot of the times the communists did not agree with that sentiment about what should be preserved. And so I, of course, am always glad to think back about when that communism had finally collapsed and gone away, and that the world was a more open place, and you could now go and visit more places and see the ancient things, the old things that are truly remarkable and worth preserving. And what I'd like everybody to get out of this then, now that I'm reflecting back on all the things that had happened and what we thought the world was going to be like here, is too many people look into the past, and you've all heard the adage that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat the bad things that have happened. And there are a lot of good arguments that you can say, good criticisms about saying that, but there are just a lot of people out there who glamorize some of these old communist ideas and these communist countries, saying that, oh, this was a free society where no one had more than anybody else, and everybody lived happily together and hunky-dory. And that certainly was not the case. There were tiers of people in society, they were rich and poor, just as they are today. But it was a lot worse. It just was not as prevalently observed because the ones at the top were so small in number, and everyone below them lived in pretty much, I wouldn't say equal squalor, but very low economic levels. And the people there, even if they wanted to, and they couldn't, by the way, leave whenever they wanted to, even if they wanted to, they just did not have money to go and do whatever they wanted with. They couldn't travel or go to other places, and they couldn't see the good things that were happening in other countries. All they heard was what their governments were telling them were the ways of the world. And if you disagreed with the government or you voiced disagreement, you could find yourself disappeared somewhere and never seen again. The person knocking at your house at night, and all of a sudden, you're carried off somewhere. And most of the time, you would never see those people again. People who had tried to flee from East Berlin were often shot in order to keep them inside of East Germany. It was terrible, the kinds of things that were happening to the people there. And of course, we have to admit that there were good and bad people in all places, but the way the government was run there and the way that those people were treated was certainly nothing to be admired or to be emulated in the future. Communist China today has learned their lesson from that and has taken direct things in another direction. It's still a totalitarian state, but they were smart enough to make it so that people can prosper and have their own money and spend it. But they were pretty much still at the mercy of the people at the top. And if you still say the wrong thing today, you can find yourself a missing person, disappeared person. Just remember, when you hear people talking about how wonderful socialism or communism is, to keep in mind what happened to people who lived in those systems. And what happened in 1989 was truly a wonderful event and a remarkable event. And it's something that we should always keep in our minds and never forget what it means to our society, what it means to freedom, and what it means to anybody who wants to continue to have the freedom that we do today in our country.